I'm Ana Parzych. I've been baking since I was 8 years old. And today I'm going to fill, stack, and decorate a 5-tier wedding cake. Today we're starting with our cakes that are already baked. This is a white vanilla butter cake. We're using a high ratio cake which will provide the support to stack 5 tiers. I'm using this tool to make sure that both layers are equal in height. This is a cake leveling tool that we designed to make it easier to make the tiers even. Scoring the cake allows me to cut it flat. Each of our cake tiers requires 4 layers of cake. To do this, we bake 2 pans of cakes and cut them both into equally sized layers. This is basically like preparing your canvas before painting. If your canvas is not perfect, your painting will not look right. It's really important that your cakes are perfectly level. This wedding cake has 5 tiers, and if one of the tiers is uneven, you will be able to tell. Here are the 4 evenly cut layers. The next thing we're gonna do is fill the layers. The first thing I'm going to do is put buttercream on my board to hold the cake tier in place. This is a traditional vanilla buttercream. This is a simple syrup to keep the layers moist. The boards support not only the tier itself, but the tier that will be stacked on top of it via wooden dowels. I'm putting a ring of buttercream around the outside of the cake. I'm going to fill it inside with the strawberry mousseline. I'm going to repeat this process 2 more times. On the second tier, I'm just going to use our vanilla buttercream. This is a classic buttercream recipe. It is very light and not overly sweet. The main 2 ingredients are whipped egg whites and whipped butter. It is important to use a butter-based buttercream which has the ability of staying soft while at room temperature, which allows me to shape it well to create a smooth surface, and also will get hard when refrigerated. This is important because when you apply the fondant, the buttercream has to be hard. I always use the bottom of the cake tier facing the top. I do this because it's a more even surface to finish my cake. Once all my cake layers have been stacked, I'm gonna do a crumb coating. A crumb coating, it's a thin layer of buttercream to make sure that you seal in all the crumbs. This is a process that takes a long time to master, but I've been doing this for 18 years. To make sure that none of the crumbs are showing through, I apply another layer of buttercream. This also helps with the structure of the cake. I keep leveling the cake with my offset spatula, but it's a very soft touch, and I keep rotating the cake to make sure that I make as evenly as possible. This cake has been filled and given its rough shape. For the next step, I need the cake to be firm, so I'm going to put it in the refrigerator for a little bit. The cake has been in the fridge for about 30 minutes. It is now firm enough for me to give it its final shape. To do this, I'm going to add a little bit more buttercream. I'm doing this just to correct any imperfections. I want the size of the cake to be square, and I'll know I'm finished when the cake has a 90-degree angle all around. I use this leveling tool to confirm that. This is our cake tier that has been filled and finished in buttercream. Now we're going to apply the fondant. We use fondant to cover our cakes. Fondant is a sugar-based paste. First, I sprinkle a generous amount of confectioner's sugar on my table, and I will start rolling it out. I want to make sure that it's circular and even, so I'm rolling it out in every direction. You can do so much with fondant. You can mold it, paint on it, you can make flowers. This cake tier is 9 inches in diameter and about 5 inches high, so I'm looking for a piece of fondant that is about 19 inches. I roll the fondant into my rolling pin, and then I'll unroll it onto the cake. Once on the cake, I will start smoothing it out. I'm using these tools. They are called fondant smoothers. They basically act as my hands. Once I apply the fondant onto the cake, I smooth it out to make sure that I don't have any air bubbles. I don't want to leave any dents on the cake. To be successful in this step, your cake has to be very cold. I know it looks easy, but it's very difficult to master this step. One of the reasons people fail is because their cake is soft. The fondant will amplify any imperfections in the cake, which is why we took so much time making it very even. Then I keep smoothing it out, alternating between my hand and the fondant smoother. This tier is finished. It's been wrapped in fondant. I've also done the same steps on 4 other tiers. Now we're going to stack our tiers. I'm going to apply a layer of royal icing to a cake board that has been covered in fondant. Royal icing will serve as our glue to make sure that the cake tiers don't move around. The bottom tiers of the cake can be very heavy, so my daughter Sarah is going to assist me. Royal icing, it's a mixture of egg whites and powdered sugar that has been whipped to a stiff consistency. I take one dowel and insert it in the cake, and I marked at the top, and then I use that as a guide to mark my other dowels. I cut them and then I insert them in the cake. I try to place the dowels not all in the center of the cake. That will give more stability. After I insert the dowels, I put another thin layer of royal icing, and then I stack the next tier on top very carefully using a spatula not to damage the sides of the fondant. Every time I stack a tier on top of each other, I use a bubble level to make sure that the tiers are perfectly even. I'm going to repeat this process for each tier. Now I'm going to insert a longer sharpened dowel through both tiers all the way through the cake board to make sure that the cake doesn't shift. It's funny to be using a rubber mallet to work on a wedding cake, but it's actually the best tool to use for this purpose. I'm making sure that the top tier is centered, so I make minor adjustments using my fondant smoothers. We use wooden dowels as support for our tiers. At the wedding, when the cake sits for long hours, the buttercream will start to soften. Each tier is supported by the wooden dowels in the tier below, so the cake doesn't settle. The last dowel goes straight through the middle of the top tier. After I insert the last sharpened dowel, I cover the little hole with a piece of fondant and then smooth it out. All the cake tiers have been stacked and the dowels have been inserted. Now we're going to start decorating. First, we're going to add our borders. I have my 50-50 gum paste fondant mix. The reason I use a 50-50 mix for the borders, the addition of gum paste helps border retain its shape while molding it. Because some fondant is really soft and gum paste, it's a stronger paste. And I'm just pressing with my rolling pin to make sure that I get the impression. I smooth it out flat against the edge of the mold. I'm going to put this border on the bottom tier. I like using the widest border at the base. I make my own molds. A lot of my molds are actually trims from dollhouse catalogs. This helps me differentiate myself because they keep my cakes unique and they are not the standard presses that you might find commercially. This cake has 3 different types of molds, but the process is the same for all of them. Here we have our finished borders. Now I'm going to paint them. I'm using gold dust and lemon extract. If you don't have lemon extract, you could use vodka as well. I'm painting the borders on this cake gold. After we paint them, these borders will be dry in a couple of minutes. The alcohol will evaporate very quickly. These are the painted borders. Now we're going to apply the borders to the cake. Before I apply the border, I use a small brush and apply a very small amount of water to make the fondant sticky. The borders on the cake can be very long, so Sarah's gonna help me apply them. Sometimes a single border is not enough to go around the whole tier, so I need to attach several pieces together. I try to put the border seams in the back of the cake so they are not as noticeable. Most of the times a cake has a back and the front, unless specifically the client has told you that the cake will be in the center of the room. I decide what the front of the cake will be. If I'm doing some pipe work, I try to do the nicest piping work or the biggest area that is being decorated in the front. I also use a paring knife to trim any excess. Here's the cake with the borders attached. The next step is piping. Here I have a piping bag that is filled with royal icing. The royal icing, it's a very thin consistency. I use a very fine tip as well. It's a 1.5 tip. When I'm doing this type of piping, it's called brushed embroidery. It's just a freehand style. It's a technique where you use royal icing to pipe a design and then use a wet brush to make strokes. You have to do this very fast before the icing dries on the surface. The texture this technique achieves reminds me of oil painting. I really enjoy using this technique because it reminds me of my background in the fine arts. It's just like drawing and painting. My designs vary, but I always draw inspiration from the weddings, whether it be a beautiful lace from the bride's dress, the invitations, or sometimes even the moldings at the venue. A lot of people use templates or draw the design on the cake before piping, but I find that I do my best work when I do it freehand, because that allows me to be organic with my designs. So here's our piped cake. Now we're gonna add color to the design. So the food colors that I use are called pearl dust, and they come in many colors. I call it makeup for cakes. I mix a small amount with clear alcohol, which evaporates really quickly, so it won't melt the icing. We use alcohol because if you use water, it will dissolve the royal icing underneath. I'm just quickly applying a little bit of color, some pearl, a light pink, and a gold detail to some of the piped embroidery. This is a painted cake. So now we're gonna make our decorations. We're using the same mix, 50-50 fondant and gum paste. I'm gonna start by applying a little bit of cornstarch to the mold. Then I take a piece of my 50-50 gum paste fondant mix and I push with my fingers to make sure that I get all the detail. And then I take a paring knife to cut all the excess. Carefully turn the press upside down and remove the piece. I use a brush to apply a small amount of cornstarch. For the second decoration, I'm using a double-sided press. Press to make sure that all the detail is imprinted onto the paste. Then I remove all the excess around the sides. Symmetry is very important for my cakes. This color aids me in keeping the decorations equidistant from each other. I'm poking holes to mark where the pieces will go. This tier will take about 10 of each mold. I'm using water here to attach the decorations to the sides of the cake. I bended the pieces a little bit to form a garland shape. I use a needle tool to press the decorations against the cake. These molds are very delicate, so I'm being very careful to not disturb the design with my fingers. Now I'm adding the lace pieces in between the garlands. Now that the lace pieces are attached, I'm done decorating the second tier. I'm also adding molded pieces to the fourth tier. The technique used to make these pieces is the same technique used to make the pieces on the second tier. I use royal icing as a glue for these pieces. Because there's less surface area, they might fall off if I just use water. I'm also going to use royal icing to pipe some stems between the decorations. Now I'm going to add the side decorations to the bottom tier. For this tier, I have a general idea of where I want the decorations to go, but what I'm really trying to achieve is to place them to create balance. On this tier, I'm also going to add some piping details, but I'm going to switch the tip to pipe Lily of the Valley. I've attached all my molds and finished my piping. Next, I'm going to show you how to make two different types of flowers. I'm going to show the sweet pea and the rose. The sweet pea is a very delicate flower. This is a 1 or 2 out of 5 on a difficulty scale. Sugar flowers can take weeks to create. The base for our sugar flowers is gum paste. This will become the center of the sweet pea. Then I take a covered wire, I dip it in the glue, I insert the wire into the disc. One sweet pea flower consists of one stem, one center, and 2 petals. Now I'm gonna cut the sweet pea petals. I take the cutter and press firmly with my palm to get a clean cut so there are no rugged edges. To give the petals the right texture and to get a more natural look, I'm going to use a flower press. I use the same press for the inner and outer petals. Next, I'm going to use a ball tool to thin the petals and give them a ruffled look. And you need to apply firm pressure. I've been making sugar flowers for over 18 years and I have invented some of my own techniques. It's something that comes natural to me and I can even create my own fantasy flowers. And sometimes people confuse them for real flowers. Then I use a needle tool to mark a line across the center of the inner petal. This will be attached to the center. Now I apply a small amount of glue to the center of the petal. Then I'll wrap the petal around the center. Once the petal is wrapped around the center, I hang it on a wire rack to dry. While the paste is still flexible, you can add some movement with your fingers so they are not all drying in the same shape. I'm also going to score the outer petal. Apply a small amount of glue. Once the inner petal has dried, we can attach the outer petal. I try to make them each unique. Just as in nature, not two flowers are the same. Now I can put the flower upright in a former to dry. Well, now comes the fun part, which is the coloring of the flowers. This is one of my favorite parts because this is when you really can bring the sugar flowers to life. For the sweet pea, I just use green and a pink. I'll then attach 3 to 5 of these flowers to complete one stem. I use a non-toxic floral tape. This is a finished sweet pea. Now I'm going to show you how to make a rose. The rose is probably a 4 or 5 on a difficulty scale. If you can master the rose, you can probably make any flower in sugar. I take a small piece of gum paste, form into a ball, and then I use my palms to shape it into a cone. This rose has 4 different layers and a calyx. Then I take an 18 gauge wire and use a plier to make a small hook at the end. The hook is something I do to help the wire stay in place. This should be set aside to dry overnight, but I'm going to continue working with a center that I pre-dried. I'm doing the outer petal layer first because it requires some drying time. Same as a sweet pea, I'm going to add texture to each petal by using a silicone press. In reality, to make a rose, you really need 2 days. You can't finish a rose in 1 day because you need drying time between the layers of petals. So that's something to keep in mind when you're working on a wedding cake. Then I'm going to use a ball tool to thin the edges of each petal. Like the sweet pea, these petals are cut from a thin sheet of gum paste. Now I'm going to use a knitting needle to curl the edges of each petal. Now place the petals upside down on spoons to dry. This is the second layer. It's the same process. I thin the edges with the ball tool. Third layer. Now I'm making the first layer of the rose. I put a small amount of glue and I attach the petals to the center. I make sure the petals are overlapping. That's the key to making this type of rose. I attach the first petal halfway through and then I take the other petal and insert it in between. I want my center to look tight and close like a natural rose would look like. Even though this is a simple rose, it's still very complicated. This curl is much tighter than the outer layer. I'm constantly adjusting the top of the petals as I'm gluing them. Now it's time to add the third layer. As you can see, these petals are a little firm, but still very pliable. For this layer, also the petals are more open. Now it's time to attach the fourth layer. And as I attach it to the center, you can see that the flower is starting to take shape. This is also when I do my last touches, adjusting the petals. Once I'm happy with the placement of the petals, I put it in a former to dry. Once the flower has dried, I attach a calyx. I use the ball tool to thin the edges and to cup the calyx. The flower really needs to dry overnight before attaching the calyx. The last step we'll do is tape the stem and dust the flower. For this rose, I'm using green floral tape. I really think a little touch of magenta brings this flower to life. That's how you make a simple rose. Now the cake is ready for me to add the sugar flowers. For this cake, I made 6 types of flowers. The first thing I'm going to do is take a bowl of fondant and attach it to the top of the cake. This will act as a base for my flowers. I'm adding the bigger flowers first, and then I'll work around it, filling in any empty spots with some of the smaller blooms, like the cherry blossoms and the freesia. Those are filler flowers. Once I'm done with the top of the cake, I use the remaining flowers to fill in the bottom tiers. You have to be very careful when inserting them into the cake. It's not like fresh flowers, they break so easily. While I'm attaching the flowers to the cake, I'm constantly stepping back and looking at my cake from different angles to make sure that it's balanced, not only with the different types of flowers, but also in terms of color. It's like a composition. This is a cake with all the sugar flowers on it. The last thing we're going to do is apply a ribbon to the baseboard. I think this makes a much nicer presentation. And that's how you assemble and decorate a 5-tier wedding cake.